It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
Loved yet controversial, meticulous yet often reckless, forward-thinking yet stuck on Victorian ideas, Winston Spencer Churchill has divided historians since his death on January the 24th, 1965, and is a man I have long had a fascination with. If you follow Top 5s on Instagram, you will know a few weeks back we attended the premiere of Darkest Hour, and let me tell you, it's a must-watch and is in UK cinemas from January the 12th. Director Joe Wright really captures the intensity of this challenging time in history, the character of Winston himself, and how his actions led Britain through the darkest period during the Second World War, changing the course of history and in turn your life. It was during the summer of 1940 when Britain looked on the verge of defeat at the hands of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Churchill became the very symbol of British defiance and used his sometimes bullish personality to stir the people up into a patriotic frenzy when it was most needed in order to face the challenge ahead of them. His legacy from this time is such that he remains the only foreign head of state to have a US Navy destroyer named after him. Joe Wright shone the spotlight on this period in his powerful movie Darkest Hour, but there is so much more to Churchill's story, and with that, here are 5 lesser-known facts about the man they called the British Bulldog. The Boer War. Given his well-documented roles in both the First and Second World Wars, it's quite easy to forget that these were not his only military campaigns. Joining the British Army in 1895 at age 19, he was eager to see military action, and using his family's influence, he was posted with a British team to Cuba, whose mission was to observe Spanish forces and their efforts to suppress Cuban rebels during the Cuban War of Independence. A year later he transferred to India and was assigned as a military journalist during a campaign against Mohmand rebels on the northwest frontier. He would write his first book based on this experience, but it was as a journalist that he was now gaining the most recognition. So much so that when the Boer War in southern Africa broke out in 1899, there was a fierce bidding competition amongst British newspapers to have him report on the conflict for them, which was won by the London Morning Post for the sum of £150,000. Taking 18 bottles of Scotch whisky with him, he arrived in British Cape Town. A few weeks later, he was with a number of British troops aboard an armoured train when it was ambushed by Boer soldiers and brought to a halt. During the fierce firefight that ensued, it was reported that Churchill's military command instinct took over, and he began organising the British defence. After more than an hour of fighting, there was little more that could be done, and he along with several other British troops were taken prisoner. While he was held in a prisoner of war camp, a few British soldiers who had escaped capture were already reporting his heroic actions, which filtered back to Britain. Unaware of this, Churchill felt shame from being captured and planned an escape. On the night of December the 12th, 1899, he managed to scale the prison walls and went on the run in the countryside. For several days, he traversed the unfamiliar territory, trying to make it back to friendly lines. He rested in the daytime and moved at night. He drank from streams and stole food from dwellings he passed in the countryside, until he met a local Englishman, John Howard, who sheltered him before smuggling him onto a freight train that took him to Portuguese East Africa and freedom. News of his escape and his exploits during the battle now solidified him as a British hero and helped open the door for his political career. Underground bunkers. London's extensive underground rail network were used significantly as shelters during the Blitz bombing campaign. Typifying this is the station on Down Street in Mayfair. It opened to the public in 1907, but by 1932, passenger numbers had dropped off to such an extent that it was no longer deemed viable to maintain, and was sealed off. This made it the ideal place for Churchill to house a bomb-proof bunker for him to run the government during the darkest days of the Blitz bombing campaign against London. The station was transformed to primarily house the Railway Executive Committee's headquarters during the Blitz, but was soon being used as a seat of the British government. Rooms were made within the station through the building of wooden floors and walls to separate the individual compartments, which included both working and living accommodation. Churchill would use numerous bunkers during the war, the most famous being of course the War Rooms. However, it's below the streets of a North London suburb that he kept one of the most important bunkers, should the unthinkable happen and South East England was invaded. Known as the Citadel, this bunker in Dollis Hill was designed to allow the British government to coordinate their war effort against Nazi forces should the German army cross the Channel. If such a scenario was to occur, then the type of war fought would most likely be a guerrilla-style campaign, since Britain's forces had been severely weakened in the battle for France. The bunker was extremely Spartan, lacking even flushing lavatories, but it could serve its purpose competently, if the time ever came. Among the personnel based there to support the government would have been a number of radio operators trained to impersonate Churchill himself, should the Prime Minister be killed, or was being relocated to a safer location if the bunker was about to fall. If the latter were to happen, then special arrangements had been made for Churchill and his staff to travel out of London on an underground train line reserved for just such an occasion. After making it out of London, Churchill and his staff would then be bundled away to bunkers out in the countryside to continue coordinating the fight. Surprisingly, many visitors to London walk right over these tunnels and straight past the bunker. Churchill and science. Born of the Victorian era, where science and technology brought new innovation at an increasing rate, Churchill was very mindful of the future and what science could possibly achieve next. His feelings on the importance of scientific breakthrough were exacerbated by the First World War, where he witnessed firsthand how technology dramatically changed the nature of warfare in just 4 years. He began the war as the First Lord of the Admiralty. At that time, the Royal Navy was the most technologically driven of the armed forces, with submarines and radio technology now firmly established within the fleet. While in this capacity, he became involved in a project to develop land ships, powerful and armoured vehicles that could break the stalemate of the Western Front. In February 1915, he set up the Landship Committee, the fruits of which would be the first battle tanks. This has led some to mistakenly believe that it was he who invented the tank, although this is not entirely true, as Churchill had stepped down from his role in the Admiralty by the time the first tanks were being tested. What was his creation, however, was the Q-ship, a warship disguised as a merchant vessel, which was intended to be used against German U-boats, thinking they would be an easy kill. By the end of the war, Churchill was the Minister for Munitions, responsible for supplying the troops on the Western Front. As such, he was exposed to the cutting edge of military technology and its application in the field. While he was no scientist or engineer himself, he had the gift of foresight and was able to look at the latest scientific and technological breakthroughs and apply them to solve real-world problems. Among others, this included the development of portable temporary harbours, such as the Mulberry Harbours used on D-Day almost 30 years later. During the interwar period, he wrote many papers on how scientific advancement would affect the lives of everyday people, and emphasised that with each improvement there would be greater demand for even better technology, reducing the burden of mankind. He even wrote that he expected mankind to soon split the atom, and outlined both its commercial and, of course, military applications. It was because of his many writings and accurate predictions contained within his work that between 1946 and 1952, he would be nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times before finally winning it in 1953. His citation read, for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. He is currently the only British Prime Minister to receive this award. He is also credited with the invention of the siren suit, a leisurely all-in-one attire that is a forerunner of the onesie. Churchill on the Underground. Whenever a story is told about a person who actually existed, or an event that actually occurred, there will always be moments where we ask, did that really happen? Well, after watching Darkest Hour, one scene in particular really had me thinking. The scene in question concerns Churchill, who, after speaking with the reigning king George VI, who advises him to guide the country through those dark days on the wishes of his people, rides on the London Underground talking to commuters who are stunned to see him sitting there, unescorted by his usual entourage. In them he finds the British spirit alive and well, which spurs him on as their leader. In many ways, the scene is a reminiscent of Shakespeare's interpretation of England's King Henry V on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, when King Henry walked amongst his troops incognito to gauge their loyalty and emotions. The scene sparked a lot of debate amongst critics and historians, leading director Joe Wright to state that while it wasn't based on a specific event, it was included to touch upon a little-known part of Churchill's war. As he put it to Eric Eisenberg of CinemaBlend.com, Churchill was known to go AWOL at times. No one could find him, they didn't know where he went, and he was also known to go and visit the people of London and seek their counsel, and also have a little cry with them sometimes. Mental illness. Churchill's personality oozed confidence, and his place in history is most associated with the staunch defiance of that fearful summer in 1940. It was this defiant energy that, perhaps more than anything else, kept the people of Britain from giving in to despair when all the odds seemed stacked against them. But those close to Churchill knew that behind closed doors he had spent much of his life battling mental illness, including bouts of severe depression. Commonly referred to as manic depression, Churchill had an early form of what we now phrase as bipolar disorder. This condition sees the sufferer experience extreme emotions, both positive and negative. Churchill was so fearful of the latter that he confessed to family and friends that whenever he was standing on a train platform, he would always stand as far from the edge as possible, or even put something in front of him such as a pillar or luggage cart, because he was afraid that he would suddenly be compelled to throw himself in front of a speeding train. Churchill would give his depression an identity in describing it as a big black dog. When he was experiencing the heightened positive moods, he would describe the dog as being quite far away, and this gave him much of his trademark energy. However, when he felt his mood starting to tumble downward, he would describe the dog as getting closer. Not long after becoming Prime Minister, Churchill began to receive medication from his physician, Lord Moran, in the form of barbiturates, which acted as sedatives to help him sleep. This was actually to combat the more manic phase of his condition, which saw his mind overstimulating with thoughts. US President Roosevelt once commented that Churchill had 1,000 thoughts a day, of which only about 4 were ever any good. Churchill would never fully shake off the black dog, although like so many in his life, he met it head-on with determination. It was perhaps a side effect of this ceaseless battle with manic depression that shaped Winston Spencer Churchill into one of history's greatest world leaders, for it forged him into the man we have come to remember. So that's 5 lesser-known facts about the man who quite literally changed the course of the Second World War. Now, he was far from perfect and made many mistakes that cost the lives of innocent people, but if not for his resilience, strength and courage, it's safe to say the world could be a different place. And that is something that inspires me, and hopefully you, every single day.